I didn't blink when she said it. Kelsey's voice was low, almost tender. You're dead to us too. She may as well have slapped me. Instead, I smoothed the collar of my coat and looked her straight in the eyes. Then congratulations, I said, voice steady, wish granted. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was suffocating. The minister paused mid-sentence. A cough was stifled in the pews behind us. My sons, Ethan and Joel, shifted uncomfortably, but kept their eyes trained on the floor. No one said a word. No one asked why. Kelsey walked away, heels clicking against the marble like punctuation marks, and sat beside Aunt Mel like it was just another Sunday. I stayed where I was. One hand on the casket's edge. The varnish was smooth, too shiny, nothing like the man inside. Tom hated pretense. He would have scowled at the extravagance, muttered something about how a simple pine box would have done. I thought of his voice, the way it rasped in the final weeks, how he held my hand and asked for soup he couldn't swallow. He never once asked for Kelsey. Not even in the end. I suppose now I know why. The rest of the service was a blur of hymns and formalities. Faces came and went. Neighbors, old friends from the hardware store, one of his fishing buddies. They looked at me with quiet sympathy, the kind people reserve for the spouse, not the spectacle. But even then, I could feel Kelsey's shadow behind me. Cold, distant. After the final prayer, I stepped outside. The air was crisp, a bite of late autumn in it. My hands trembled, not from grief, but something colder, betrayal perhaps. Joel came up to me briefly in the parking lot. Just let it go, Mom. Today's not the day. He walked off before I could respond. I turned back toward the chapel doors, then glanced at the hearse. The casket was being loaded. I watched them close the doors, sealing him in, knowing I would ride to the cemetery alone. It wasn't just Tom we buried that morning. Something else had died, too. And I would discover just how deep the burial went when I got home. I had planned every detail of that funeral. Every flower arrangement down to the folded white lilies Tom used to cut from the yard each spring. The music, the minister, the program. Even the reception afterward with coffee and bite-sized sandwiches. It wasn't for show, it was for him. But no one had asked if I needed help. Not once. Kelsey hadn't returned my calls in the days leading up to the service. Joel emailed me a brief "thanks, Mom," and Ethan didn't answer at all. I figured grief had its own rhythms. I hadn't expected silence. When I arrived at the chapel that morning, they were already inside, my 3 children, sitting in the 3rd row, surrounding their uncle's wife, like she was the one who'd carried them through the flu. Mended their shirts, waited in ER lobbies until dawn. Not one of them turned when I entered, not even a glance. I sat in the 7th row. Alone. A man behind me whispered, "Isn't that her, the widow?" His wife hushed him gently. Tom's sister sent a nod in my direction but didn't rise. No one rose. When the service ended, I waited until most of the guests had made their way toward the doors before walking up the aisle. My legs moved like they didn't belong to me. As I reached the 3rd row, I stopped. Kelsey had her phone in hand. Joel whispered something to Ethan. "I just wanted to say goodbye," I said quietly. Ethan stood and blocked my path. "Please don't cause a scene, Mom." I blinked. "I'm not." Kelsey didn't even look up from her screen. "This is about Dad," she said. "You don't get to make it about you." My mouth opened, but no sound came. They turned away, all 3 of them. I stood there a moment longer, surrounded by the scent of lilies I had chosen, listening to the rustle of coats and the scraping of pews. Then I walked out. The wind had picked up outside. It caught the corner of Tom's funeral program and sent it fluttering across the sidewalk. I bent to pick it up. I pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires like it always had, but something was wrong before I even stepped out of the car. The porch light was off. The hanging fern I'd watered every morning was gone. The welcome mat was rolled up and shoved under the bench. When I reached the door, my key didn't fit. I tried again, slower this time, willing the lock to remember me. It didn't. I checked the garage side door, locked. Back porch? Same. I stood there staring at my own door like it was a stranger. Then I called Ethan. No answer. I tried Kelsey. A moment later, a text appeared. You're not stable. Uncle Henry said we should take precaution. Dad wouldn't want you there right now. Precaution. The words spun in my chest like a blade. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked around to the back porch. That's when I saw them 3 trash bags lined up in a crooked row, each stuffed with my clothes. My winter coat sat on top of one sleeves, crumpled like it had been stepped on. No suitcase. No boxes. No care. My nightstand drawer was tipped over inside the bag, its contents jumbled. My prescription bottle was missing, not emptied. Gone. I searched through every bag and found nothing. No toothbrush, no phone charger, no socks. But the bird feeder Tom built last spring. It was hanging there, dry and empty, seed tray cracked, like even the cardinals had moved on. I walked to the mailbox. Just one envelope. My name typed in block letters across the front. No return address. Inside was a copy of a restraining order, effective immediately. Signed by a judge I didn't recognize, citing mental instability and emotional distress to surviving family members. I sank onto the porch step, envelope in hand, bags of my life rustling behind me. The sky was darkening, but no lights came on inside the house. My house. The motel room smelled like bleach and loneliness. I paid cash at the front desk, using the emergency bills I'd hidden in my coat lining for years, the kind of habit you pick up when life teaches you not to rely on anyone. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came too quickly, and I was still staring at the ceiling when I called Wallace Greer's office. The receptionist's voice was careful. Clipped. He's no longer representing you, Mrs. Beckley. Before I could ask why, she added, but someone will meet you out front at noon. At exactly 12, a woman in a green blazer stepped outside, walked past me without stopping, and slipped a small, folded note into my hand. Then she crossed the street and vanished into a nail salon. The note was simple. Ask for the box. He left it in your name. I took a cab to the bank, heart pounding harder with every block. The teller barely looked up when I handed her the note. She asked for ID, disappeared behind a steel door, and came back with a narrow metal box. She led me to a private room and left me alone. Inside the box was a thumb drive, 3 notarized letters, and a handwritten list titled Unrecorded Assets. At the bottom, in Tom's handwriting, was a short note. They think you're weak. They've forgotten what you remember. Use this when the time comes. My fingers shook as I unfolded the first letter. It was dated 8 months before he died, signed in front of a notary, and began with, "In the event that I am deceived or manipulated." The second letter mentioned a trust. The third detailed changes to his will, updates none of the children knew about. Each had legal stamped signatures and a copy of Wallace's old letterhead. The thumb drive held a video, but I wasn't ready to watch it yet. I locked everything back in the box and walked out of the bank into the crisp air, carrying only the note. I didn't know when the time would come, but now I had something they didn't know existed. Back at the motel, I plugged the thumb drive into the old loaner laptop I carried for emergencies. The screen flickered. Once then, opened a folder labeled simply, "For Her." The first file was video footage, grainy but clear enough. I watched as Kelsey rifled through Tom's file cabinets, snapping photos of documents. She didn't know the camera was angled from the hallway mirror. Another clip showed Ethan jiggling open the locked drawer in the den, removing what looked like a thick folder and stuffing it into his messenger bag. Then came the audio. Low voices, muffled but unmistakable. "Just tell him it's for taxes. He won't ask questions in his condition," Kelsey whispered. Ethan's voice followed. "He trusts us." If we wait too long, it'll be too late. I paused the video and sat still for a long time, listening to the air conditioner hum. Every doubt I'd carried since the funeral turned sharp. They hadn't just written me out of grief. They'd rewritten the ending before it ever arrived. The next file was the list of unrecorded assets. At the top, $22,000 shares in a logistics company I'd never heard him mention. A cabin in Maine, purchased under a trust name. A vintage coin collection he'd started as a boy, valued at more than I ever guessed. None of it had been listed in the will I was shown after the funeral. Then I opened the last letter addressed to me. I changed my executor 3 weeks before I died. You'll need to act fast. Trust Wallace. They will lie. Do not let them shame you into silence. It was dated, witnessed, notarized, every legal seal in place. My phone buzzed with a new text from an unfamiliar number. Wallace Greer. Meet me at 7 a.m. sharp. Bring everything. Come alone. I stared at the message, then at the thumb drive still warm from use. Whatever they'd built around me was starting to crumble. And now finally, I had something solid to stand on. The lobby lights were still off when I arrived. Wallace opened the side door himself and led me into his office without a word. Waiting inside was a woman I didn't recognize, neat blazer thick folder in hand. She stood as I entered. This is Judith Kramer, Wallace said. Your husband's accountant for nearly 20 years. Judith gave me a polite nod and sat back down, opening the folder. We need you to see this, she said. These are the last 4 wills your husband signed. All notarized, all in order. She slid them across the desk. The most recent, dated 3 weeks before Tom died, listed me as the sole heir. The signatures were steady. The witnesses, legitimate. The others were older, one included our children, another named a trust, but none were the one I'd been shown. Your kids submitted this 2 days after the funeral, Wallace said, handing me a single sheet. Claiming it was the corrected version, I studied the page. It looked rushed. The language was vague. The signature wasn't Tom's, not the way it used to curl slightly at the end. I stared at it, something tight winding in my chest. Judith leaned closer. He couldn't even hold a pen by that point. I was there. I watched him struggle to sign a birthday card. They're claiming coercion, Wallace added. That you manipulated him while he was ill. I said nothing. My mouth felt dry. We're prepared to file for injunctive relief, he continued. But it will go public. If we challenge their version, it won't be quiet. The court will see everything. Judith met my eyes. It's forgery, Nadine. Fraud. But they're still your children. I folded the fake will, tucked it beside the real one, and stood. No, I said. They used to be. Wallace gave a slow nod. We'll file today. First hearing could be within the month. I looked out the office window. A storm was building on the horizon. Then let's get ahead of it. The cabin sat tucked behind tall pines and a gravel road so narrow I had to slow to a crawl just to keep my tires from slipping. It hadn't changed since the last time Tom and I came here together, back when the kids were too busy for long weekends. He always said this place was where his mind could breathe. I unlocked the door with the key he'd hidden years ago behind a crooked plank near the porch light. Inside, the air was dry and clean. Dust on the table, but no sign of intrusion. Just the smell of pine and the faint hint of wood smoke lingering in the walls. The maps were still pinned where he left them. Routes we'd planned to drive, but never did. A faded Polaroid of us at Acadia tucked in the corner of the window frame. And on the floor near the fireplace, the rug shifted too easily. Underneath one loose board, I pried it up with a kitchen knife and found the safe. It clicked open without resistance. Inside a USB drive, an envelope labeled "Last Words," and a small stack of documents bound with a red tie. I plugged the drive into my laptop. The video opened with a low hum, then Tom's face filled the screen. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his voice was steady. If you're watching this, I'm gone. And they've tried something. I wish I were surprised. He paused, looking off screen for a moment. I was blind too long, Nadine. I kept hoping they'd come around. I thought if I gave them just enough rope, they'd tie something meaningful with it. But they used it to pull away from everything that mattered. He laid out the assets, some I knew, most I didn't. Stocks. Property offshore accounts he had protected in trust. He had documented it all along with notes about the children's behavior. Red flags he hadn't acted on until it was too late. I've made you the guardian of everything. Until someone proves they loved me more than they loved power. The screen faded to black. I sat in silence. Then I opened the red-tide file. The courtroom echoed with the sound of shoes too expensive for grief. My children entered, flanked by 2 lawyers each. Their suits pressed their expressions blank. I sat alone. Wallace had offered to sit beside me, but I said no. I wanted them to see that I could stand without anyone propping me up. The judge's voice was calm, almost bored, but Wallace spoke with precision. He presented the original will, the video from the cabin, notarized documents, and forensic analysis of both signatures. He called Judith, the nurse, who held my husband's hand steady as he signed the last version. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. Kelsey's mouth tightened. Ethan never looked in my direction. I wondered if any part of them still believed I was their mother, or if I'd become just a barrier between them and the money they wanted. The judge leaned back in his chair as if already forming the decision before the final words were spoken. The revised will lacks legal standing, he said. Forgery is evident. The estate remains under the terms of the last notarized will. I heard the words, but didn't celebrate them. Wallace asked quietly if I wanted to pursue criminal charges. I looked across the aisle. Kelsey stone-faced. Ethan fidgeting with his tie. Neither looked remorseful. Neither looked surprised. It wasn't grief that brought them here. It was calculation. Not yet, I said. The gavel came down. Case closed for now. Outside, the air felt colder than it had when I entered. Reporters gathered, but I walked straight past them. Coat pulled tight, head high. At the parking lot, Wallace offered to drive. I declined. I need to go somewhere first, I said, starting the engine. He nodded once and stepped back. I took the highway north, not toward the motel, but toward the one place I knew still had space for memory and not betrayal. The cabin was waiting, and I needed to hear Tom's voice again, just once more, before I decided what came next. I didn't go back to the house. Not once. The locks, the walls, the memories, they could keep it all. Let them argue over its appraisal value or what furniture belonged to whom. I signed the release forms and walked away. Letting go of the house was easier than I expected. Holding on had already done enough damage. I returned to the cabin instead. The mornings were cold, but the air was honest. I cleaned each window myself, sanded the porch rail, and replaced the cracked sink. Tom always swore he'd fix next summer. With each repair, I stitched something back together, not between me and them, but between me and myself. 1 week in, I found a letter in the cabin's old mailbox, forwarded from Wallace's office. The envelope was crooked, the handwriting young. Owen, my grandson. I'm sorry for what they said, the note read. I miss you. I didn't know what was true. I stared at the words until the ink blurred. Then I picked up a pen and wrote back. You can visit whenever you want. No one else needs to come. I sent it with no expectation. Later that month, a notification popped up on my phone. Kelsey's face lit by ring light, her voice syrupy. A sponsored video tagged with "D Grief Journey." She apologized for the misunderstandings, then segued into a promo code for an herbal comfort tea. I watched in silence, then deleted it without reply. Instead, I mailed Tom's vintage coin collection to a local veterans fundraiser. He would have liked that. I contacted a nonprofit that supports widows and funded 3 caregiver retreats in his name, paid in full from the cabin's appraisal. This place wasn't a relic. It was a beginning. Some days I cooked too much food just in case. I left the second porch chair out just in case. The lights flickered sometimes, and I laughed instead of fixing them, because Tom used to call that charm. It's been a year since the funeral. A year since I stood in a chapel filled with silence, sharp enough to cut, and chose not to break under it. This morning, I walked up the hill behind the cabin with a cup of tea and a letter I had kept sealed for months. The trees were starting to shift color reds, creeping into the tips yellows, humming beneath the green. The lake below was still just the way Tom liked it. The envelope was labeled in his hand. For the last hill. I opened it slowly. Inside, just one line. Thank you for knowing me. For staying. I folded it gently and tucked it into my coat pocket. I didn't cry. I'd done all the crying already. Owen had called last night. He and his fiancée were coming up next week. He asked if they could plant a tree by the porch. Something strong, he said. Something that lasts. I told him yes. I told him I'd be here. There are still days when the quiet cuts a little. When I reach for someone who isn't coming back, or catch myself thinking I should call one of the children before remembering why I won't. But those moments pass now. They don't own me. I've rebuilt the cabin room by room, not just with wood and paint, but with memory. I've filled it with letters, photographs, recipes I remember from the early years when the only thing we had to offer guests was coffee and good conversation. And now there's a second chair on the porch again. I looked out across the lake, steam rising from the rim of my cup. My voice was quiet. But I didn't need it to be loud. I'm not dead to everyone I said, not even close.